thanks for coming by. And we're here to enjoy the encore presentation of Gene Fedorko's segment of this amazing 77-minute film documentary.
Yay!
Something about gay elders. I had a hard time getting there. The other thing we want to say is last Sunday, Gene invited us to come over and he selected 21 pieces here from his amazing collection that is in both rooms, and it'll be up tonight. And hopefully throughout the month we plan on having it up. So we're going to set up viewing dates. We'll talk to you about that, and maybe an event later in the month where Gene can talk more about the art, and we'll have the barbecue and all that. That'll be forthcoming in the next 3 or 4 weeks. Anything else? Would you like to say anything before we start the movie, the film? Okay, so we're going to have a short introduction by David Weissman, under 3 minutes, and then we're going to have the documentary.
Hi, I'm David Weissman. I'm the producer and director of this Conversations with Gay Elders project. What you're watching tonight is one in a series of 6 what I call conversational documentaries, all with gay men who realized that they were gay in the decades before Stonewall. And the project focuses on how these men navigated finding comfort in their identity in the decades when there was really no clear social or political context for a positive self-image for gay people. I partially made this project because as I grew older, I realized that I had lots of questions about my family history and there was no one left to ask. So on some level, I wanted to make these films while this generation of gay men was still up and about, and so that future generations would have access to some kind of understanding of what it was like for this generation whose experience was qualitatively different really than anyone who came out after Stonewall. So each of these pieces was edited by a young gay man. All of my editors were in their 20s and 30s. So the whole project was a kind of a cross-generational collaboration, which was a truly wonderful experience. For me, I was sandwiched between the older men and the younger editors. And I think the editors got the benefit of this wonderful experience editing these stories of these men who, Gene actually was the youngest, he was 72 at the time, and the oldest at the time of interview was 86 years old, I believe. But the editors got to spend quite a lot of time with these men, and also there was a mentoring relationship with me as the filmmaker, and also I benefited so greatly from their youthful perspective that they brought to understanding and appreciating and editing the material. So I guess that's all. I always get asked at screenings what I'm doing with this series, and I actually don't know yet. It's all played out differently than I anticipated, both in production and exhibition. So where it goes from here is still a question. But the pieces are all quite rich and quite different, and they barely scratch the surface of the kinds of stories that remain to be told. But in many ways, I hope that they serve the function of encouraging particularly younger people to ask questions that it might not have occurred to them to ask. And maybe when they're, at a party, that they'll choose to sit next to a 80-year-old and ask to hear their story rather than, having those people be invisible. So anyway, thank you for coming. I hope the evening goes well. I know it will. I'm sure you'll enjoy the piece because Gene is a wonderful, captivating storyteller. And I guess that's all. Thanks. Bye.
Two of the themes that I noticed went through my life, really. And one of them was activism, played a huge part in my life since I was, 19 years old. And Jimmy and I went to hear Martin Luther King's March in Washington, D.C. And the other theme is medicine. and working at Dr. Bellman's office for 28 years during the apex, the intensity of inner city AIDS epidemic. We've seen it all. Those were very intense years, and we saw a lot of destruction and a lot of death. And to that extent, I wanted to invite Dr. Bellman to the panel. A true fucking hero of the AIDS years. And this guy would come to work. He would go to the hospital at 6 in the morning and leave the office at 11:30 at night. He saves, he saved so many lives, you know. And another person that was really vital to the years of activism is Sean Strub, who started Pause magazine, and I invited him to be on the panel. And if anybody has questions about medicine or activism, here are your references right here. Yeah, welcome Sean, welcome Paul. Yes. Questions? Oh, come on, kids, now. This is New York City. This is not like fucking Pittsburgh or something where we're like intimidated. Yes, Jimmy.
Thank you, first of all, each of you, for what you have given our community. Gene, what I said is louder now, but as I was saying to each of you, thank you for what you have given back to the community in the darkest of days. I have two questions. I'd like Sean to talk about the almost miraculous recovery that you had at a point where you were near death and new medications came in and they worked. Gene, I'd like to ask you how you realized, working in the office of Dr. Bellman, that the most important thing to do when a person full of fear and shame came through the door was to welcome them with a hug.
Yep. Thank you. Sean, go ahead. Here's a, oh, you have a mic.
Everybody understands that when combination therapy came out, how dramatically that changed what it meant to have HIV. And as Jim notes, I was somebody who was very fortunate to be around when it still came out. I, at one point, weighed 40-some pounds less than I weigh now. I was covered in Kaposi sarcoma. My CD4 count was down to 1, had pulmonary Kaposi sarcoma. But my survival, that was obviously important, but it was the years before that, and it was the doctoring and the community that kept me alive to that point that I don't think has been as well understood as everybody understands how combination therapy, you know, was so effective. And the other thing that I'm thinking about with Paul and Gene and that partnership for so many years, and I was a patient of Paul's and saw Gene in various doctors' offices and seeing different people different times. Not just the incredible and intense emotional toll it takes to be dealing with that day in and day out, and the hundreds and hundreds of people seeing dying, and the pain and suffering and so much. But also the kind of courage and conviction it takes with Paul, within the community of your peers, your professional peers, and the price that is paid, particularly for the physicians like Paul, like Joe Sonnabend, a short list of others, and people like Gene, because Gene might as well have been a doctor. I mean, he did as much doctoring as about anybody, to really listen and learn from the people they were treating and following their conscience in sort of doing that, even at the expense sometimes of professional standing and respect and being marginalized and all sorts of other things. I think that's one of the untold stories of the epidemic. And so I just wanted to mention that, because when I see Paul and Gene, I just think of my admiration for them, for their guts and their courage of sometimes not following what the AMA and the pharmaceutical industry and the mainstream AIDS Inc. was telling them they should be doing. I believe it resulted in better doctoring. At Joe Sonnabend's memorial a few weeks ago, I started out by saying something that a lot of us know, but nobody ever says. Patients of Joe Sonnabend's, and I would say Paul Bellman's as well, lived longer. They survived better. They got better doctoring. And that better doctoring, I don't think, has been understood adequately.
Well, look, I would sort of like to add to that, or to answer that in some way, and kind of bring it back to Gene, because there's a part of unless I fell asleep for a few minutes during it, I apologize if I did, but I seem to have missed a discussion of the fact that Gene founded a very important organization back in the darkest days, or co-founded back in the darkest days of the epidemic, called Heal. And Jimmy Ferret was either a co-founder or very involved in that. And that was a place where people came, oftentimes with AIDS, with complete confusion and suffering and fear and the reality that they were dealing with, and really had no place to go where they were, as you put it, welcomed. And more than anything, Heal sort of shifted something in at least the people that it touched, for at least some of those people, to give them a sense that, there was some care or concern. I mean, I just want to be a little philosophical about it, because this is something I've thought about before, but it's coming to mind unexpectedly right now. Back in the day, when someone was HIV, feared they were HIV positive, maybe they weren't tested, they just thought they might be, or were wondering where things were, or they had AIDS, or they didn't know. I always like to sort of think about it as there was a trauma, a feeling that I'm abandoned by the universe, like the universe has just abandoned me. And that was, incredibly stressful, traumatic. And then you add in stigma, and that itself accelerated, in my mind, the progression of people's illnesses. And Gene was really a seer. He got it. He understood how important it was that people felt that the universe cared for them. Now, maybe that's a fantasy, but I don't think it was, because it was something that people could feel and experience, and that was healing. And the other thing is that there was also, in that time, and Sean, you were very aware of this dynamic, where the early treatments for HIV weren't particularly effective. And sometimes they were oversold, and sometimes for individuals, they were toxic, as the saying goes. And so there was a lot of distrust of the medical community, and a lot of that was based upon people's experiences. So there was a lot going on. And it was just so important from my point of view as a doctor to do everything that I could to help that patient, not to, the things that I couldn't help them with, which I wish I could have, but at least to somehow feel that everything, that they were welcome, that they were cared about, and that everything that could be done, that was going to be done to help them in what I always viewed it as a race for survival. Even if it seemed a very remote possibility for some people, Sean exemplifies someone who, it seemed as if at a particular point, one rationally might have thought, there's not a lot of hope here. But, Gene was very much someone who was and I think the deep experiences that you had in terms of your own suffering that come through that documentary, pre the AIDS epidemic, and then of course having your partner and loved one himself, who was a wonderful man, John Crates, who was my patient, who was someone who didn't make it, who I wasn't able to bring to him the therapies that, I would have so much wanted to do. But all of that, in the midst of all that, Gene was in that organization. I'll say one or two other things. I'm sorry, I'm on a little bit of a roll.
Okay.
But I'll just add one or two other things. So Heal was very focused, and as I just recall, Jimmy Farad was very much a pioneer in this, which was to help people to understand that there was a lot that we didn't know. And when there's a lot that we didn't know, that also creates some possibilities that maybe there are other things that people can try, that might help, And so Gene and Jimmy and many other people were very interested and open to people trying various things and gathering more evidence and more information about what could be more helpful and what wasn't going to turn out to be so helpful. Other doctors became more aware of that. I mean, historically, I hate to kind of go back to this guy over and over again, but, Joe Sonnabend was a pioneer of giving people medicine to prevent the most common deadly pneumonia, PCP. And that was not standard medical practice until 91. Fauci said, don't do it, and even though it was clearly saving the lives and extending the lives of so many people, and Sean was Joe's patient before mine, my recollection is that was a bridge that helped you to get to the point where you could take the cocktail. And then the holistic therapies that were oftentimes, really denigrated by the medical profession, which unfortunately in a clueless way led people to feel further distrustful, that was a whole chapter. And one of the things that I noticed is that there are patients of mine who in 89, 90 said, Dr. Bellman, I want to do this herbal cocktail. I want to do ozone or vitamin C, whatever it might have been. And to the extent that I was able to get behind something, if there's something I felt was really harmful, or it was expensive and it was ripping the patient off, I wouldn't be, that supportive of it. But if I felt it was reasonably safe, there are patients of mine I'm convinced are here today because of taking things that maybe might not have passed a placebo-controlled trial, but nevertheless was empowering enough to reduce the amount of trauma and stress, and also their belief in me. That maybe that same patient who would have distrusted taking the cocktail even because the experiences were so bad, well, if I had developed a trusting relationship with that patient, then when I finally had some medicines that would be more effective, they would take them. And Gene, tonight's about Gene, and rightfully so, Gene was intrinsic to the whole atmosphere of my practice, that I was it was a collaborative relationship with Tyrone, with the other doctors who worked with us over the years, like Dr. Sue and Dr. Laras and Dr. Dalton. My mom was there early on, and she was part of the office, which some of the patients remember who go way, way back. And so that's just some comments.
Well, I think there are 2 books and a movie to be done about our office, about Paul Bellman, the office of Dr. Paul Bellman. And the movie Philadelphia was based on our patients, and in fact we were the medical advisors.
Well, there was a documentary of our office done by Juan Botas, who was a patient who unfortunately died of AIDS in '92, and that's actually part of the Philadelphia kind of DVD, although people don't get DVDs anymore, and he was very inspired by his experience of coming to the office and did a whole documentary that Jonathan Demme was the person who made, and that led to the making of Philadelphia. It was directly from it.
I'm not sure people realize how horrible AZT was when it was first put on the table as a solution. And I remember talking to one of the doctors, Dr. Bellman, about AZT. We had patients coming to HEAL meetings who had black fingernails, and they said, I can't take that stuff. It just makes me nauseous and depressed and suicidal, and I've lost weight, and I think it's making me sick. And I mentioned this, I was in Texas, and I mentioned this to a doctor in Texas who was part of some trial about AZT. And I said, you know, your drug is actually killing people and hurting people. And his response was, well, that's all we have at this point. And I said, what kind of an answer is that? That we're supposed to, and homophobia goes in there. There's these gay men, their lives are substandard, not worthy of like the elevation of like straight people who are much more important. All those factors played into the early days of AIDS. It was ugly. It was ugly. And Paul, I keep forgetting the name of this drug that cost 10 cents a pill that you were giving to patients that you received a lot of criticism for. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, we can go in that direction in a moment, but I think more, maybe more relevant to the documentary, and as I was watching it, I was really thinking about this, is your own experience of feeling stigmatized, and well, you put it as well as you could, as a young gay man, as an adolescent, adult, etc., and that even with your partner, the difficult story with his parents and family not accepting him or you, you know, all of that was part of the stress and the actuality of particular patients' situations. Yeah. You know, so it was a really powerful, important thing, and it wasn't something that you could just say, you know, just in words. Oh, you know, although verbalizing is helpful, you know, I accept you, you know, for who you are completely, but it also required, or it was helped by just an atmosphere that went beyond one person. But Gene, you were catalytic in my office in creating an atmosphere of incredible acceptance. So on that, I mean, just in terms of something that you taught me, I remember one time, because Gene was like, at the end of this day at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, Gene was my confidant, the only person I could really talk to about what I was living through was Gene. And sometimes we'd have fun, we'd laugh, you know, make jokes, gossip, but it was serious too. And at one point I said to Gene, you know, I don't quite get the fact that this particular guy is gay. I mean, I thought that was like an innocuous, okay thing to say, you know. And Gene, in a very compassionate, educational way, said, Paul, he says, you don't really get it. It's like gay people are incredibly diverse. You can't just say, you know, that a person is gay because they're this way, or they're not because they're this way or that way. And that was something that was really very, very helpful. Another Gene pearl of wisdom that he imparted to me that was very, very impactful is that I noticed one day in the office that Gene was very animated in talking to this Latino gentleman from Harlem who was on Medicaid, who was in very difficult social circumstances, and nothing wrong, but I said to Gene, I said, you know something, you seem to be as engaged with this particular person, as you are with anyone else, including a celebrity patient, and then Gene, without missing a beat, said, Paul, I find everyone equally interesting. And that was something that also just cut me to the core of trying to understand that each person that I was privileged to take care of and connect with, etc., was equally important, equally interesting, and Gene, thank you for enlightening me.
I have something to add to that. So I remember when I first started seeing you dealing with Gene. And Gene was incredibly warm and supportive, and if there was an insurance issue or whatever it was, he would be on the phone and be going out of his way. And there was a little part of me that at first was like, I'm getting special treatment. I'm like from Paz. I'm like your treatment. Until I sat in the office. He was there with every single patient. It was he went out of his way, beyond and beyond and beyond. And I want to say something about Heal, because I think this is an important thing. I forgot that Gene's role with Heal. That, when Michael Callan wrote his book Surviving AIDS that came out in 1990, first of all, remember that some, including in the gay press, accused him of offering cruel hope, right? The idea of surviving AIDS. And Michael said, there's no such thing as cruel hope. Hope is hope. And he interviewed a bunch of people who were then long-term survivors, meaning they'd lived 3 or 4 or 5 years, right? He found they had 3 things in common. The first was they believed that survival was possible, that somebody was going to survive it. The odds may not be great, but somebody was going to survive it. And so operated from that assumption that survival was possible. The second was they could identify a reason to survive. The third was always the one most interesting to me. When asked what they had done to treat their viral infection, it wasn't what they said. It wasn't that they had tried this or that they had tried that. It was the length of the list. It was, acupuncture and macrobiotics and massage and prayer and, cucumber enemas and, whatever, all the crazy stuff that was out there. And that's one reason, when I ran Pause, we never would use the phrase quack doctor or quack treatment or quack cure. If it wasn't expensive, obviously exploitive, if it wasn't posing a health risk, we just set it out there. People were finding help and hope in it. We did that. And that was reflective of your office and philosophy of doctoring, which was not common at all, against this backdrop of the belief someone's going to survive.
Yeah. And people were desperate in those years. There were doctors that were running to Israel to get AL-721. A doctor was going to Mexico to bring back I forgot what. But people wanted to live, and they were desperate. And then AZT came along, which I thought was so cruel that was being given and distributed and propagandized to people with HIV. Heavy propaganda marketing went along with those drugs. And you're right, Paul. I've been knocked around so much in my life because I'm gay. And I've had so much prejudice against me. And I've survived all of that. And I took the compassion that I learned from all of that. And these poor patients would walk into your office or a Heal meeting, and it was almost forbidden to touch other people with AIDS at the time or with HIV, because you thought, there was this ridiculous trope that you might get it from like being close to somebody or touching their skin. And I read someplace where this guy was hugged he had HIV and Kaposi sarcoma, and somebody hugged him, and he said it changed his life, that somebody was able to touch him, because they were like the untouchables, like the lowest caste in India, And I made it a point that everybody that walked in, and believe me, everybody that came into Dr. Bellman's office or Heal was scared. We were all scared, myself included. We thought we might It was unknown what was going to happen to us in our futures. And I made sure to hug every patient, every man, every woman that came into the office, to make them feel connected and not like they had leprosy and not like they were like a discard, a discard from the universe, you know. And while I have a moment here, I want to thank the women who came to the aid of the gay and the HIV community. And it started with Heal, and our first Heal meetings were mostly women. And there were women that wanted to help in any way that they could. And as the AIDS crisis grew in volume, the women stepped up. And in ACT UP, and just in general. And I don't think the women are thanked and appreciated enough for all that they did. And to this day, if I'm on Facebook and I put down that, hell, I have the flu, maybe I have COVID, I get like 14 calls from lesbians who want to bring me food, or they send me soup from matzo ball soup from 2nd Avenue Deli, and I really appreciate it very, very much. Yeah, thank you, women. Yes. But yes, it was quite ugly of the beginning days of AIDS, and a lot of sickness and a lot of. I remember one time I was in B. Altman's, the old department store, and I saw the most poignant sight. There was a man there, maybe he was like in his 30s, mid-30s, and he had Kaposi's sarcoma lesions all over his face and wrists. And he was with his mother. And I guess they were shopping for pajamas or something. And it was just such a touching tableau that his mom came from wherever to stay with him and help him shop and to be with him while he was dying. Yeah.
I want to just touch on one or two things on this.
Please do.
Something that occurs to me. You know, one of the things that you were certainly very much a part of, and I was mindful of, is that healing has a lot of different dimensions. Healing, it's not just about getting better, because we're human beings, and sometimes we don't heal from this or that, or, you know, et cetera. So I remember once, and I can't visualize the patient in particular, but I remember once seeing a patient, maybe 91, 92, and the patient was pretty sick and had seen a couple of other doctors. And I remember thinking to myself that, you know, I don't think that there's anything particularly that I know to do to help this person get better that hasn't been done already as well by another doctor that person has seen. And then it kind of hit me in this particular situation that this particular patient had come to see me, not for me to help them to live, but for me to help them to die, you know, to be supported in that part of their journey. And Gene, you're helping create the atmosphere in the office that was there, both serious and lighthearted, I believe helped me to help that person, you know, and many others in that aspect. And sometimes it's paradoxical, because that moment where someone releases that fear, that can be healing back into life, you know. So who knows? We don't know. But I just think that being aware of those dimensions of things is part of the doctoring process, and Gene, you were part of that, as were numerous other people I've mentioned.
I wanted to mention something that really struck me in the film was the coming out process that in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And I'm a little bit younger than you, but I related to a lot of it. And the isolation and the not understanding that there were other homosexuals, let alone a community of homosexuals. And that isolation, we talk about these worst years of the epidemic, and a lot of us of a certain generation, we want these kids to understand, and a lot of them aren't interested in hearing about grandpa's war stories, but there's something before that, the coming out, the isolation that was there. Today, people come out in 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade to peers, right, in their school, whatever. Typically from a similar social class and very similar. They're coming out in a horizontal way. That's not what happened years ago. You might have messed around with somebody in school a little bit, but you generally came out to usually a somewhat older man who showed you around. You'd go to New York, you'd hitchhike, you'd take the bus, you'd meet a guy, you'd live with him for 4 or 5 days, he'd show you around, you'd be introduced to this whole world. And that is something that I don't think people understand. I think there's something in that that's lost. The going to the card catalog, people of a certain generation knew what it was like to go to the card catalog in their high school or the junior high school and look up homosexuality, right? Because when you sort of understood this concept existed, you went there. When how to have sex, when everything you always wanted to know about sex, but were afraid to ask, came out. Coincidentally, in June of 1969 is when that book was published. And looking up the pages about homosexuality in there. The isolation, there was no internet, there was no way you could read. And I remember the first time when I recognized a homosexual couple, and then I remember the first time when I recognized there were like a group of them. There was like it was in 1970. It was the Gay People's Union at the University of Iowa that had a parade. There were about 30 or 40 people, and I remember I don't think I saw it, but I remember reading about it in the paper, and it was like, oh, there were a number of them. They clustered. And that's something that is really difficult to convey to a younger generation, I think.
So we have a question.
Yeah.
I was wondering, there were so many battles that you fought in all kinds of ways, but I was trying to remember, were there, the political atmosphere at the time, were there political people that were helpful? I know there were a lot of people that were not, and it was kind of fraught in terms of getting things to happen for everyone. But I was just trying to remember if there were any sort of decent political people that helped you along the way, or helped the activism, bring more light to it. I just can't remember at that time who were some of the good people out there politically. Is that? Well,
I mean, there's certainly in various realms were political people who were helpful and political people, who were not. The interesting thing to me about those very early years of the epidemic is how it was just when the gay rights movement was transitioning from being a sexual liberation movement that came out of the 60s cultural change into a political reform movement, where we were looking at a place at the table and starting to pass legislation, generally municipal non-discrimination ordinances. And there was that sort of first generation of political leadership in that realm. And in a collective sense, when the epidemic hit, they weren't excited to talk about what gay men were doing in bathhouses and back rooms. This was not something. So, we know the failings of Ronald Reagan, and we can go through all that. We've never really looked at our own community's leadership, not to blame people, but to sort of understand that context at the time and how we might do things differently today, learning lessons from that. Because I think there is a lot to be learned there just from within our own, LGBT queer political movement. Because those issues are still there today.
Well, I always had this sense that it was our job as gay people to educate the world about what's going on, because there was so much stigma and degradation of people with AIDS and so much prejudice. And even in the early 80s, there was a lot of homophobia. It was rampant in the White House. And I remember my boyfriend, John, right before he died, he said, honey, there are two things that gay community that we've contributed to the world. And he said one of them was disco, and the other one was anal sex, because all the stories about AIDS caused people to think, oh my God, these guys are like doing these things in bed. This was verboten before that. People didn't want to think about gay men fucking each other, you know. It was like, ew, you know. And we brought that, you had to think about it with AIDS and the talk about sex. And I noticed in my personal life and at work that some of the younger, it first started with people of color, Latinos and black guys, that all of a sudden they heard anal sex, and they were having anal sex with their girlfriends. They would tell me, you know, and this was like in the 80s, you know, and then it even evolved into there is that dance step called twerking, where, you know, which was metaphorically about anal sex, and we did bring that to the community, to the world, and I'm very proud of that. And it's a much more relaxed atmosphere out there now that we could talk about these things without you know, freaking people out at the dinner table or something. Yeah. Joel.
I was struck by the fact of thinking about Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson and the difference in the world that they lived in and what the world became. I came to New York in 1968 and I went to Columbia graduate school. I started therapy. I came out to the therapist, and he said it was a sin, not a sin, it was a sickness. And I remember him bringing me in front of a committee of people. I ended up in conversion therapy. Very far left politics. It was not possible to be gay and be far left. And so I got pulled into a world that was not my own, sort of a romantic world. And it just didn't work. And what struck me the most about what you were talking about is the difference between Sylvia Rivera's world and the world, what the world became, and how we're not going back. No more. And your reaction was an emotional breakdown. My reaction was to be super intellectual and to not embrace that physical aspect of my life. And then my life fell apart, and I caused a lot of harm to a lot of people. You cannot live without desire. Cannot happen. This was a revolution.
So the therapist, that was a question I had. Gene, when you came back to Pittsburgh and started seeing the therapist in Pittsburgh, I didn't get from the film what the therapist told you. They wanted to deal with your sexuality as a problem or as something to try and help you address.
I don't know what the hell they were talking about. It was so primitive and medieval. Mm-hmm. And one of the interns, they came to interview me every day with a couple new interns and stuff. And it was like Freud 101. Somehow the question came up, did I ever see my mother's vagina? Right. And it turns out that I did. One time I came home, my mom was on the sofa, her kimono was open, and I saw her vagina. And they jumped on that, Freud 101, like, oh, how did that make you feel? Were you upset? What were your emotions with that? And I said, it was nothing, no big deal, no biggie whatsoever. Every day they would go back to that question. What did your mother's vagina mean to you? And I'm like, these clowns are focusing on my mom's vagina, and I'm in here for amphetamine addiction and alcoholism. And I mean, what's going on here? It was very, very primitive and stupid. And Yeah, that was Psychiatry About Being Gay in the early 60s. That was 1964. Yeah. It was a very crude world back then, yeah. Yeah, and is there another question? And definitely Ken. Oh, I'm sorry, Willie. Wait, we'll
I can
Ken,
do that.
and
I can do that.
And then we'll close.
You know, I just wanted to say, I found out about this a couple of days ago on Facebook. I didn't know this was happening. And I was very excited to be here. And I'm, at this moment, or since I've been here, so grateful to be here. I was a patient of Paul's way back, probably somewhere around the time Sean was. And so I was privy to the office and Gene's energy and kindness and interest and warmth every time I showed up there. And, you know, I haven't been hearing, I haven't been in an atmosphere of hearing this kind of conversation in a long time. I mean, I used to go to many things and meetings and so forth. So I'm sort of back in this wonderful, sharing experience. Paul saved my life. I was sitting behind him and I wrote in my notes, I keep a little journal, and I said, I'm sitting behind Paul Bellman right now, like 30-something years later, and who I haven't seen. And he saved my life. I had pneumonia twice, I had CMV. I woke up from the table and I looked at him and he said, we almost lost you. And, that's a very impactful experience. I felt like, and I feel like I was in a war and my captain saved my life, and unforgettable experience. I thought I saw a white light actually before that, but I think it was the hospital light. But anyway, I don't have a specific question, but I just wanted to, a huge, strong hug and gratitude for that time in my life where I wouldn't be here, and I've had I've had 30 years of life now.
Thank you, Ken.
Anyway, that's it. So anyway, great to see you.
Wait, one more question.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Gino, for being such a wonderful and beautiful soul, a healer, and a radical that step up for your beliefs and your inner self. You've always been yourself, and that's why the universe has brought you all this joy that I just can relate. I feel inspired from you, from even before getting to know your life and your documentary. You have that energy and that soul that, it's real, and getting to understand your history and your suffering and all the history of the AIDS epidemic at that moment of life in which everything was kind of exploding with the arts, with the liberation, and you're just inspiring me just to think of how was the world coming to act together, since you were talking here in America and New York, like the capital of the world. I was curious to see how was this activism, like with Hill, starting up, and how was the media allowing the progress and the development of how was this going to be kind of approached, or if it was just going to be taboo, or so how was the whole momentum of uncertainty, and how was the media and the political movement at that time? Was free speech? Was it capped? Was it united all over America? Was it internationally helpful? And so it kind of inspired me to think of how was all those deals coming along
Well,
together.
the media was ridiculous, and the New York Times didn't use the word homosexual, I don't think, until like 1988 or something. And HEAL, our organization, we encouraged free thinking and critical thought. So did Dr. Bellman, so did Sean. And that was marginalized. You know, it was better to go with run with the crowd. We were definitely marginalized by the media in the beginning, and yeah, it was a battle. It was a battle. Activism was marginalized, and yeah. And thank God for people like Larry Kramer, who took this to Hollywood and to Washington, D.C. He had a big mouth and he talked about these things vociferously. And I don't want to ignore you. If you have a question or something.
I want to ask, how did you find each other? How did you find this doctor? As a community, I am wondering. And I am wondering, in these years, why it was this big?
Why was what?
AIDS was this big in your community. Why it was?
Well, it was an epidemic, yeah. And I met Dr. Bellman at a talk that we sponsored, and he came up and gave me his card at the end of the talk. And he became my, I would go to HEAL meetings, and Dr. Bellman became my medical advisors. And I would have questions about medical studies or about AIDS in general. And I would go to Paul, and he was kind of like my mentor, my advisor. And then he asked me to compose a library, which I had enough intelligence to do, about AIDS. Just something very crude and simple and basic, A, B, C, D. And I did that, and while I was at the office, Paul would say, oh, Gene, the phone's ringing off the phone. Could you get this phone call, find out what, you know. And then that led into like 12-hour days, you know, where I would get there at 9 in the morning. And
Doctor is very important.
Very, muy importante.
Relation between you and love.
It's huge.
It's very important. So,
thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's really been great.
Thank you, Al. Thank you for your energy.